Born to Run. Before we took our little show on the road, we had arranged to do some production rehearsals with our newly acquired stage set and lighting rig. It was arranged for us to set up in the huge assembly hall of Queen Mary College in Whitechapel. It was the first time we'd seen our stage set and it looked very impressive. There was a huge film strip, like a film negative, that extended from above the stage, ran underneath a small drum riser and finished across the stage. One of the frames of this strip was for our projections. We had about 200 lights arranged in a grid above us with a hefty chunk of PA system either side. When we arrived, we couldn't wait to fire it up. Mark and I spent a lot of time in front of the speakers just listening to it, enjoying our newfound freedom of playing with radio transmitters and not being confined to the stage by guitar leads. This sort of technology was new at the time, and to have a transmitter that would be sure to work all over the world meant an outlay of $2,500 each. It was a lot of money to pay out, but it meant that there was never going to be a danger of hearing the local cab company trying to raise a fare whilst we were in the middle of the Power of Love. We had 3 days of this staging with everyone getting involved and developing little quirks and dynamics and events during the set. It was the first time that our sound engineer, Mike Scarf, also of AC/DC, had been given the chance to fire us up through a full PA. We recorded bits and pieces of it onto cassette and listened back to it later, and we were all very impressed with the sound and confident that we'd done a good job in the previous 6 weeks' rehearsals. We were ready to rock America. Our confidence was given a bit of a bash on the last day of rehearsals when Trevor turned up to run the rule over our live sound. He wasn't complimentary, and in fact had more than a few negatives to bring to our attention. He was suggesting changes to the running order and was even suggesting arrangement changes and nitpicking over some of the synth sounds. We were due to be flying out in 3 days and he comes in and wants to change stuff. We were not that experienced and thought we'd done a great job, and to have our producer, mentor and head of our label turn up and act this way was a little disheartening to say the least. After he left, wishing us good luck on the way out, we had a little meet on stage to discuss what he'd said. We were unsure, and maybe he was right. He'd been right so far, hadn't he? This is where a great intervention by Peter Oxendale really turned our mood around. He could see we were a little freaked at the disappointed reaction of Trevor, and he climbed down from behind his mountain of keyboards and ripped into him. I can't remember the exact words, but it went something like the following. "I can't fucking believe that. How fucking unprofessional can you get? We've been working away in rehearsal for 6 weeks and he hasn't deigned to put his fucking head round the door, yet he turns up on the last day of production rehearsals and spouts all that fucking shite and negativity. Take no notice, lads, he's talking bollocks. I've done more fucking gigs than him, and if I'm telling you it sounds fucking great, then take it from me, it sounds fucking great." I don't know whether Pete felt a little hurt because he'd been criticised for some of the sounds, but it did the trick. A couple of strong words from the straight-talking Yorkshireman plus a few words from Mike Scarf agreeing with him put us on the front foot and restored our confidence. To this day, I don't know if Trevor thought he was being helpful or whether he was trying to re-establish himself as the boss of the Frankie sound, but my opinion changed of him from that day forward. Fuck him, we're going on tour. ZTT, but mostly Trevor, had tried to dissuade us from going out and tried to convince our management that we weren't capable of delivering our sound to the masses, and we'd proved them wrong. We could hear it for ourselves. We were ready to kick some arse, and after almost 2 years of stage absence, we couldn't wait to go. We flew out of Heathrow on the 29th of October 1984 and would spend the next 7 weeks entertaining our fans. We were waved off at the airport by some hardcore Frankie fans who always seemed to know of our whereabouts, and a handful of paparazzi. A year prior to this, there was nobody on the other side of the Atlantic that had heard of Frankie Goes to Hollywood. The precious few who knew we were coming were largely Anglophile music followers that were confined to the east and west coasts of America and north of the border in Canada. It was strange that the American music market bore little resemblance to the UK, yet Canada's top 40 almost mirrored it. Apart from a sprinkling of Canadian and American talent, the chart looked very much like a British one, and it was Canada where our transatlantic adventure would begin. We flew to Ottawa for our first engagement at Porter Hall, a part of the University of Ottawa, and I don't remember too much about it, to be honest, and I think this first show was a bit of an icebreaker to iron out any teething problems we may have had. I do remember that there was thick snow everywhere, but unlike the UK, people seem to be getting on with the daily business without the trauma we experience at home. My impression of Canadians before arriving in their country was a nation who didn't mind a punch-up. This opinion was formed watching ice hockey on television. After our sound check, we went for a drink in the university bar, and within 5 minutes of our arrival, a punch-up had started over a game of pool. One guy was restrained before smashing his mate over the head with a pool cue, and within minutes of the flare-up, they were hugging each other and apologising. I guess that's the way they let off a little steam over here. We flew from Ottawa to Montreal to do 2 nights at the Spectrum Theatre, and scalpers were doing a brisk trade outside on both nights, according to our tour manager Ian. It was the first time I'd ever heard the word scalper. I guess that description is more apt than tout. Tout makes the job sound more businesslike, whereas scalper gives a better description of what these people actually do. I guess everyone has to earn a living somehow, but I can count on 2 fingers the amount of times I have employed their services. Scalper, I feel, is still a little too kind. I refer to them as shithead vultures, but let's not split hairs. We leave Montreal and fly to Toronto, where we have a day off before doing another couple of shows at the Toronto Concert Hall. On tour, days off are not really days off. They're spent doing various other forms of promotion, whether it's radio interviews or press interviews, but your day has several large chunks taken out of it before you can go and do what you want. We arrive in Montreal and go to the hotel where there was to be a press conference. We knew we had a day off coming, so that meant the previous night had been major party time, and we all arrived at the press conference looking a little ragged and blurry-eyed. We'd never done a press conference before, so it was a little weird being wheeled into this huge room at the hotel and being confronted by about 50 journalists and half a dozen film crews. The whole thing passed by without much incident, except for one question posed by a female Japanese reporter who stood up and asked Holly, "Who was the artist responsible for the artwork on your album sleeve?" "It's done by our drummer, Ped," he lied. She turns to address Ped and asks him, "Your work is very reminiscent of Picasso and his famous Guernica painting. Are you a fan of Picasso?" "Oh yeah, he's fucking boss. I'm well into a bit of Picasso." The lady asking the question tells him it's really excellent and starts a round of applause that's taken up by the whole room, whilst Ped is holding his hands up in mock embarrassment. We did some mad promotion whilst we were in Canada. Two Tribes had been a hit, and somebody at Island Canada thought it'd be a great idea to hire some military hardware for a trip down Yonge Street to Sam's record store where we were due to do an in-store signing. We walk out of the hotel to be greeted by 2 huge army trucks with open backs. They were kind of a troop carrier, and the front one was empty to take us, and the one behind was filled with about 40 people, all in camouflage gear, wearing t-shirts that said POF on the front, meaning they were prisoners of Frankie. On the way, we stop at a car park near some retail outlets, and there's a tank parked up there that's going to lead us down Yonge Street to Sam the record man's shop. There were 1 or 2 pissed off commuters who were not too happy about their daily journey being disrupted by a tank going 10 miles an hour and an army truck of young men and women dancing to Two Tribes as it blasted out of a small PA system in the back. There's a huge crowd outside the shop, and we're ushered in and take our places at a long table, and all the fans are ushered in to get their records signed, take a photo, or if they were bold, steal a kiss from one of the band. We'd done a couple of these before, and the novelty was well wearing off. Don't get me wrong, it's great to meet your fans in this way, and to see so many people excited at the prospect of saying hello or shaking your hand is a humbling experience, but that didn't stop the lads from fucking about. If you were unfortunate enough to be the last in line for a signature, you can guarantee that your face would have been adjusted by someone further up the line. The amount of people who must have signed copies of Pleasure Dome where the members of the band have had additional scars, moustaches and dicks drawn over them must run into thousands. The best part of the in-store signing was the owner would love to give you a bunch of music to take with you on tour, and we often left these events with bagfuls of cassettes and other merchandise. Our next stop was Washington, and our promoter in the States, Bruce Eisenberg, had planned a great little coup for us. Our Washington gig was to coincide with the American presidential election on November the 6th. Bruce figured that all the hip and groovy kids would want something to do on the night rather than sit at home and watch politicians bullshit each other on TV in the race for votes. Reagan got 4 more years whilst we were sleeping off a victory of our own after slaying the Washington public in an old cinema in a dodgy part of town. I remember it was a cinema because one over-enthusiastic punter had flung the bottom half of his seat at the stage and it crowned me right on the back of the head. We did all the landmarks of Washington and had our photographs taken outside the White House and the Lincoln Memorial. Whilst we enjoyed Washington, all our eyes were set on our next destination, New York. We were going to spend a few days in New York and use it as our base and commute to gigs in Philadelphia and Boston. As well as a 3-night stint at the Ritz, we were going to be appearing on Saturday Night Live. This was going to be massive exposure for the band, and what made our appearance a little more special was it heralded the return of a former presenter. George Carlin was coming back for a one-off hosting job. We had no idea who George was, but we were more than aware that this was a big deal and that it would mean even more people than usual would be tuning in to see the show. I wish I had known then what I know now about Mr. Carlin, as I may have exchanged more than just a handshake. His passing in 2008 was a great loss to dark humour on both sides of the Atlantic. We did the rehearsal for the show on Thursday, and transmission was an hour or so before the show actually went out live. We performed Two Tribes and Born to Run. It was our US TV debut, and whilst we were match fit in terms of our performance, performing live on TV means that you're putting your trust in the hands of the sound guy in the studio, rather than having your own sound guy tweaking the knobs. American TV unions would never allow outsiders doing their job. The overall sound was a little weedy, but it showed the American public that we were a real band who played real instruments, and we weren't the manufactured puppets of ZTT. Whilst in New York, we were having a ball visiting iconic clubs like Danceteria, Limelight and Area. We were generally taking in too much of everything that the City Never Sleeps had to offer. Area was a themed nightclub, and I remember thinking when I entered that it must have been designed to make you think you were tripping. As I entered the club, there were muscular young men covered in talcum powder and made to look like statues. On a plinth in another part of the club was a woman dressed like Jackie Kennedy in her Assassination Day clothes, but sitting inside a child's toy car, waving at the passing clubbers. The entrance had a bunch of window displays with various exhibits, and I remember sitting watching Jed staring into this display and giving the middle finger to whoever was inside it. I got up to investigate, and in the window was a guy lounging in front of a TV in a pair of swimming trunks, a swimming hat and goggles. There was no picture showing on the TV. Instead, there was a strobe firing randomly and the guy in front of it was motionless. I asked Jed what he was doing and he told me he wanted to get the guy to move, and he figured the best way to do that was to flip him the bird and pull faces at him until the guy lost his rag and reacted. He eventually did, getting up and saying, "Fuck you, you jerk! You got a problem?" "No, but I made you move, lad." Jed walked away, pissing himself laughing. Area was the first place I'd ever been to that had unisex toilets with men and women milling about inside, chatting over the sink and openly sharing gossip and drugs. It was on one of these visits to Area that I reconnected with Boy George, but he didn't remember our meeting years earlier in Camden. Peter Oxendale had managed to track down Bonnie Tyler and invited her on a night out with the lads. She was recording in New York with Jim Steinman and came out for more than a few beers. I would even go so far as to say she drunk us under the table. What a lovely woman and really great company. She became an honorary lad from that point on. 2 years later, when Peter Oxendale attended my wedding, he brought along a posh napkin containing a message from Bonnie. He'd been doing a TV show in Europe with her days before the event, and she sent her best wishes to me and Claire written in lipstick. Unfortunately, this was nicked or accidentally thrown in the wash at the hotel where our reception was, and the only time I saw it was when Peter presented it to Claire and I. Gutted. Peter also organised a beer with Ian Hunter and invited us along to say hello. He looked exactly the same as he did when I'd seen him performing All the Young Dudes on Top of the Pops. In fact, I saw him in a Mott documentary last year, and he still looks the same. Long hair and big sunglasses equals no signs of ageing. Well, I guess I can still do one of those. Whilst based in New York, we travelled by limo to gigs in Philadelphia and Boston before returning for more partying. The Boston gig was in a club called the Metro and was memorable for the fact that the venue was right opposite Fenway Park. I'd never been close to a baseball stadium, and it was always good to see iconic amphitheatres of sport, whether I knew much about baseball or the Red Sox. The other memory of the club was that the stage was quite small and the ceiling was very low. The lighting rig was so close to the stage that our lighting man, Paul Devine, was able to focus and position the lights by just reaching up, as they were all at arm's length. Great gig for him, not so great for the band. When we took to the stage some hours later, it was like being under the grill. All that was missing was a nice garlic and herb marinade, and you could have had a Frankie barbecue. 200 lights blazing away less than 3 feet from your nut meant we were breaking sweat from the first bar. The highlight of our New York visit was a 3-night sellout stint at the Ritz. The Ritz was a long hall with a balcony running all the way around it. I recall looking up into the balcony on the first night we played and seeing a guy with blonde spiky hair dancing and punching the air and looking like he was really enjoying himself. When we came off stage, I remember saying to Ped, "See that guy in the balcony who was freaking out? He looked like Billy Idol." Minutes later, Billy walks in through the door. I can't remember his exact words, but it was something along the lines of, "Fucking brilliant show, guys. These fucking American cunts ain't got a fucking clue, have they?" Billy was particularly impressed by Mark's bass playing, and weeks later Mark had get a letter from him via our management asking him to join Billy's band. I will mostly remember these shows for meeting a couple of members of my family in New York. My mum's brother Teddy Rogan had lived in New York since before I was born, and I had never met him. He came to the show with his wife Jan and their 2 children, Billy and Mary. It was great for Mark, Jed and I to get some photographs with our New York family to take back home to show my mum and my Auntie Josie, as they had not seen him for years. I think the 3 of us were the last people from the UK to see him, as not long after our meeting he was killed in a hit and run. This was particularly sad, as Teddy had survived throat cancer, and when we met him he was talking through one of those electronic voice boxes that you hold against your throat. Ron Weisner invited one of his artists to our show. Patty Austin was introduced to us backstage and posed for a few photographs with the band. She was a lovely woman and up for a giggle, and it's a shame I don't have any of those photographs to remember that meeting by. I don't remember much about what we talked about, but she was telling me our career was in safe hands with Ron and asking us about England and Liverpool because she was a Beatles fan. Name me one musician who isn't. After one of the shows in New York, I got a call from Holly whilst we were in my room partying. He told me he'd just shared the lift with Eddie Van Halen and told him how jealous I would be when he informed me. Eddie told him to tell me to give him a call and pop up to his room. Holly rings me and tells me this, but I'm bugled off me nut and worse for wear. I couldn't do it. I had the opportunity to go and hang with one of my all-time heroes and it was ruined by cocaine. In fact, I could have gone up there with my bugle and had a few stripes with him. I would have been way too paranoid, and trying to hold it together would have been a nightmare and ruined the experience completely. A friend, some years later, would describe cocaine as the party you never get to. I don't think he could have been more accurate. The phrase stuck with me and I turned it into a song about cocaine horrors a few years ago. You will never leave the room while you have it because wherever you are going, you will not be able to consume it as comfortably as in your own room. More of this subject later when we reach Miami. Ian Jeffries introduced us to sushi in Philadelphia as there was a Japanese restaurant across the road from the venue. And apart from one visit to the Carnegie Deli for one of their famous sandwiches, we spent all our time devouring sushi. The sandwiches in the Carnegie Deli were not like anything I'd ever seen, and the filling was contained between 20 different varieties of bread. I ordered corned beef and was gobsmacked when a sliced tin of corned beef, about 3 inches thick, jammed between 2 slices, landed in front of me. That's not a sandwich, that's a cholesterol fest. I don't claim to be an expert, but I still think the best sushi is in New York, and we were going overboard on it. We were smashing tekkemaki rolls for breakfast. Sushi wasn't the only thing getting smashed in New York. I managed to get hold of some cocaine while we were there so I could stay up late and enjoy the delights of the city. This wasn't like the stuff I got when I was in Liverpool. I got it from a girl that I met in the bar at the Berkshire Place Hotel where we were staying. She was a Frankie fan and had previously worked there, so she could drink in the bar without getting any grief from the staff because she knew them all. She introduced herself by sending over bottles of Heineken to our table and instructing the barman to say, "Relax and enjoy." Her and a pal joined us for a beer, and I asked if she could get hold of any bugle. She told me a Puerto Rican neighbour dealt it off the rock, whatever that meant, so she was given some money in exchange for a concert ticket and a backstage pass, and she went off to get something off the rock. The gear was like a sugar cube and turned up in a little brown bottle. It took about 20 minutes of crushing it with a spoon before you could put it anywhere near your hootie. I snorted. Fuck me. So this is what all the fuss is about. I count this as the first time I really tried cocaine because the stuff I'd taken previously was fucking child's play compared to this. I was so far out me nut I would have had to pay to get back in. So began 3 days of drug abuse that would end with me feeling like shite on the day we left New York for Atlanta. I'd only drunk beer and water for the last 24 hours, and I was, technically speaking, partied out. I was glad to see the back of New York, as I think a lengthier stay may have resulted in serious injury. At the airport waiting to board, I was feeling pretty ill. The amount of hard swallowing I'd been doing the night before, in an effort to rinse the last drop of goodness out of the Puerto Rican flake, meant my throat had taken a bit of a battering, so when we arrived in Atlanta I had to go and see a doctor. I was diagnosed as having strep throat, for the medically minded streptococcal pharyngitis, which is basically a sore throat with a hoof on it, but that was the least of my problems. I felt totally fucked, not good considering I had to do a gig in a couple of hours. I wasn't so wasted that I couldn't play, but it was going to take a lot more effort than usual. We played the show, and I'm operating on about 80% with adrenaline making up 50% of that. It wasn't like anyone would have noticed as we played a storming show at the Atlantic Civic Centre that ended in a stage invasion with the Invaders dancing with the band at the end of Relax, which was always played twice, the second time as our encore. No partying for Nash. Guitar dropped on the floor and taken straight back to the hotel for some rest, while the rest of the band went out and partied on my behalf. We moved on to Cleveland, and I was again sent back to the hotel under orders that I should rest more. I was trying to complain and be a hero, but I realised that a few days off the beer would be just what I needed to get back on top. We were staying at some really nice hotels, but however nice they weren't as entertaining as being out on the town with your mates after the show. We arrived in Detroit and are staying downtown in a hotel just by the Joe Louis Arena, and the three lads decided to take a stroll around. The place was deserted, and it seemed everyone had left town. We were the only white faces on the streets. I remember visiting a Woolworths store to browse their records and thinking it looked like it was having its last day of trading. In fact, the whole place looked like it was waiting to be torn down. I googled this and had a look at it via Street View, and there are hardly any people in the pictures, so I guess nothing's changed in the intervening years. Before the show, we went to a McDonald's, and I was wondering why there was no menu on the wall behind the counter. It showed pictures of their meals with numbers next to them. I asked someone about this later and was told it was due to the large levels of illiteracy in the area. This is fucking America, not the Amazon jungle. It was an eye-opener to say the least. I was told nobody but the poor lived downtown and the rich white folk had all moved out to the suburbs. This experience was a stark illustration of the rich-stroke-poor or the black-stroke-white divide in the US. The show was at a small venue called St Andrew's Hall that looked a bit like a large scout hut on the inside and rather ramshackle. At the sound check I was having some problems with my pedal board and getting a lot of unwanted buzzing. I think this was down to the electrics being a little unstable, and there was the occasional taxi cab message coming from the PA. I was hoping it was going to be okay for the show, but my worst fears were realised when after the second song of the set, something jammed on the board that meant I had the choice of having every pedal on at the same time or every pedal off. I struggled on for a couple of songs before French John heroically rigged up a smaller 4-pedal combo to replace my board. I wasn't the only one to suffer at this gig. When we came to play Relax for the encore, the sequencer on the PPG decided it would like the rest of the evening off. I will attempt to describe what it sounded like. Not easy, but bear with me and I think you'll get it. The song starts with a synth sound and Holly's Mahaya, and then the familiar sequence would kick in. Doot, 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 doot. You get the picture? This time, Holly sings the intro, Aid Cook presses the button to start the PPG, and we hear doot, 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 doot. splutter, cough, thank you and good night. Whilst this was going on, all of the lights on the Jupiter 8, the synth containing the trademark brass stabs, all come on at once, and Nat decides to knock off early with the PPG. Aid bins it out the mixer at the back of the stage and pulls the Jupiter 8 with it. We thrash through the song and make it to the end, but it was a shambolic version, and one that we wouldn't wish to be heard. This wasn't the only time the PPG went on strike. It had happened a couple of times during the tour, but we always managed to get through to the end. But without the PPG sequencer underpinning everything, the song sounded like a distant cousin of our familiar hit. We left Detroit hoping to return one day to the Joe Louis Arena on our next visit and see our PA hung from the rafters just like AC/DC's. Our next stop was Chicago, and what would be the most momentous gig of the tour.